What I have perceived in all this is a massive narrative shift that went from you're a racist to think that this virus, the China virus, you can't call it that. You can't consider the fact that maybe this virus came from the Wuhan lab. And now it did come from the Wuhan lab, but we're still not connecting the dots when it comes to EcoHealth and Fauci's funding through NIH to Peter Daszak. The fact that the WHO put Daszak in charge of the investigation into the Wuhan Institute of Virology, like all of it seems to be obfuscated by the Chinese are the problem. The CCP is the problem. And it feels to me as if they are ramping the American people up for when Russia inevitably wins the war in Ukraine. They're going to transition us into a Cold War, hopefully just Cold War footing over the Taiwan situation with China. That's my read of it. I'm curious if you have a different one.
My read is darker than yours. I don't think the Taiwan situation will be cold. I think it'll be hot. I think Biden is loony enough to think that somehow an island can defend itself from a continent, and somehow thinks that we could get hundreds of thousands of troops and material through the Chinese Navy, which is twice the size of ours. I don't know how that could possibly happen, but he's promised to do it. But yes, the Cold War will return in Europe. There's no question about it. Victoria Nuland manifests the attitude of the State Department, which is the attitude of much of the foreign ministers in Western Europe today. If you get a chance, read an English translation, unless you're fluent in Russian, of Vladimir Putin's speech to the Duma, more or less his State of the Union speech on February, I forget it was 21st or 22nd. This is the speech where the West said he'd be brutal, bitter, nasty, and vengeful. It was one of the most rational speeches ever given by a head of state in the modern era. Rational, tempered, moderate of tone. He truly believes that the West is the cause of this, and we know the West is. Yeah. Maybe if George H.W. were still around, he would recognize, yes, we promised Gorbachev that NATO would not move 800 miles eastward, and it did. And the weapons are there, and they're aimed at Moscow. And people like the president of Poland wants to use those weapons because he somehow thinks that Crimea can be liberated from the Russians. I mean, this is like Texas would be liberated from the Americans and returned to Mexico. I mean, it makes as much sense.